Welcome into another episode here today, recording on a Saturday. It's November 19th, 2022. Hope you're all having a great week or weekend. I'm joined, as always, with our pod guest, Kyle Diesel. Kyle, how are you today, my friend? Kyle?
I'm doing all right. I
Okay.
can't complain. At least we're not like the folks about you.
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. You cut there for a second, but I got it. I didn't quite know what you said, but I think you asked me how I was doing, and I'm doing well. I'm doing well. It's a Saturday before Thanksgiving in a couple days. I got to work 3 days next week. I'm kind of mentally checked out already, if I'm being honest. It's one of those it's one of those situations where it doesn't matter how old you are leading up to a holiday like this. Everyone's kind of ready for a break. Uh,
Mhm.
it's been a long. We were just talking about it before we recorded. It's been a long few months since the summertime ended. So yeah, I'm looking forward to a break, and I think all of our listeners are as well. But Kyle, you reached out to me earlier in the week, and I know a lot of our listeners enjoy the NHL. And you brought up a great point to me, which is that we don't have a lot of coverage nationally about the league, and you and I decided it was a good idea to spend some time talking about the NHL today, because we are in that point. I just mentioned Thanksgiving, and one of the big measuring sticks for the NHL is if you're in a playoff position by the time the United States has Thanksgiving, then you're likely to find your way into the playoffs at the end of the year. Obviously, there's exceptions to every season, um, but I think this is a good opportune time to talk about the NHL as we head toward Thanksgiving. So, what are your initial takeaways? This is also great because both of our teams are off to amazing starts. So, we didn't plan this necessarily when we started chatting earlier in the month. Um, but, Kyle, what are your early thoughts on the league as we get going here?
Yeah, the league is very interesting this year. I mean, if you look at the teams that we thought were going to be super hot, like half of our picks earlier from last month are kind of off and wrong. But yet again, the season's still young, just a few games in, but
Yeah.
it's kind of in that part of the season where you kind of have to start finding your strides. I mean, for example, we thought the Flames and the Maple Leafs were going to do really well this year, and right now Maple Leafs are getting hit by a lot of injuries, and Calgary's just not clicking together. They just not gelling with all that firepower. And like what we talked about, saying the Bruins, we thought they're going to be a decent team. Now they're one of the best teams, and you thought the Devils were going to do pretty decent this year. I thought they're going to still be at the bottom feeder team. They both proved us wrong, being one of the best teams up there with
Yeah.
the Bruins and the Knights.
Yeah, and I thought the Devils. Yeah, let's just jump in, talk right about New Jersey. I see you're wearing your hoodie, your red hoodie there. Um, There we go. I thought the Devils could be like a bubble wild card team because a lot of people were talking about the Red Wings and the Senators. I think we both brought them up last month as being like a team that we expected a lot out of. But I threw New Jersey into the mix because I thought that they had some ingredients there to be a good team, but I just didn't know if it was all going to click. It looks like it has. I mean, I wrote down that. I mean, I think Jesper Bratt has been probably the one of the best forwards in the league so far this year. I think he's second or third in the league in points, behind like I think only McDavid or Matthews Draisaitl, one of those guys. Like I think he's top five in points in the league as of this morning when I looked. So like I think he's one of the reasons why you guys are up there. And then the rest of the team, like Tomas Tatar, second in the league at plus minus. He's been a beast. So yeah, what are your thoughts on obviously your hometown team, the Devils, and why they, as you mentioned, are one of the best teams in the league so far?
Well, let's start first with the acquisitions this offseason. First of all, with the trade with the Bruins to get Holla for one of the best face-off persons the Devils have besides McLeod at the current moment, but also getting trading with Washington for their previous goaltender, Vanacek, and also for drawing a blank, Dan Marino from the Pens. Three huge trades that I didn't think were going to amount to much this year, and they paid off well. And I think also we're seeing that our younger stars, now that their seasons for 2 or 3 years, have the experience, but we're also seeing how fast and how high power this team is now for the first time. This team is one of the best teams with offensively and defensively. This is kind of looking like the old fashioned Devils, except with more firepower on the offensive side. When Marty was back in the net and they had Scott Stevens, the early 2000 Devils, kind of a way that they're allowing shots. They're allowing the least amount of shots in the league, but they're also putting up one of the most shots in the league. But they also talked about how much of a push they're getting offensive. They're causing great turnovers. Other teams zone crisp passes that we didn't see the last 2 years, which is amazing. I think Rupp has done a great job at transforming his team, turning it all the way around. But I guess we've only played the Canadian team, but I haven't seen us play much the Metropolitan teams yet, so things could turn around once we start playing them. But I don't know. This team looks very, very good as they continue to go for their new win streak record of 13 games. They have to beat Edmonton and Toronto one more time to do that.
It would be 13-game winning streak.
That's their team record, 13 straight. But this is their best start ever as a franchise.
That's amazing. And it's actually the Bruins' best start as a franchise as well. When they lost the game to Toronto, everyone was like, oh, like they missed out on an opportunity to be, I think, they would have been 11-1, which would have been their best start through 12 games. But then what happened is they haven't lost a game since that game. So they've now won 5 in a row since that loss 2 weeks ago today. And they're now 10-0 at home at TD Garden. So they played a quarter of their home schedule already and are undefeated at home. So they're in a very similar position. You mentioned the Eric Haula trade. Now that's interesting because there are a couple former Bruins on. Is Dougie Hamilton still play D for you guys? Yeah. So you got Dougie Hamilton, you got Eric Haula. Both of those players seem to make huge impacts on your team this year in that historic start. But then on the Bruins, Pavel Zacha is on pace to have a career year. He was involved in that Eric Haula trade. A lot of people thought he was an upgrade 1-for-1 if you looked at him mano-a-mano, but I think it was more of a draw between those two. I think they were very comparable players. But I think what's allowing Zacha to go to that next level is he's playing alongside David Krejci most of the time, or Charlie Coyle most of the time. So he's playing alongside a really good center, like a really good two-way center, not somebody who's offense only, right? And it's allowing Zacha to be creative in the offensive zone. And he's racked up some points early on. A lot of people were a little bit nervous because in the first couple games, he was deferring to Pasternak and Krejci, but now that he's playing with DeBrusk and Smith and Coyle and some of these other players, he's now the best guy on the line, and so he's taking on some of that scoring. So I really like Zacha so far. And then I think another reason why the Bruins, like the Devils, have gotten off to such a good start is the Bruins are playing really good on the penalty kill. They're second in the league in penalty kill. I think only the Sharks are ahead of them. And they're 90%. And Hampus Lindholm has been the best defenseman in the league. I think other actually probably than Bastian or not Bastian, Tatar, or the other defenseman you have whose name I can't pronounce. I think Lindholm's been the best in the Eastern Conference for sure, and he's an early Norris candidate. I mean, obviously you look around the league and you got Adam Fox and Seth Jones and Cale Makar and all these other great defensemen. But I think Hampus Lindholm, if you can point to one player as why the Bruins are who they are so far, it's him, because he weathered the storm on defense until McAvoy got back, and they haven't missed a beat since. So it's a really exciting time to be a Bruins fan, equally an exciting time to be a Devils fan. But ironically, these two teams have not played each other yet. They at the end of next month, they'll play each other twice in Jersey in 2 out of 3 times. It's a little weird schedule. The Bruins
right before Christmas, right after Christmas.
Yeah, it's right before Christmas, and then 4 days later in Jersey again right after Christmas. So I think for both teams, that will be a big test. You mentioned the Jersey schedule. Do they have anybody coming up like that is up at the top of the league?
Like I said, the only team are the Canadian teams this coming up week, and those are still two high-powered teams. Let me take a quick
I think it's
look
Edmonton
here,
and
see who
Toronto
they.
this week.
They just played the Senators today. They won 5-1. I just finished watching that game. Um, but looking at their schedule, they got the Oilers on Monday, Maple Leafs on Wednesday, Sabres on Friday. But next week they start playing more of the Metropolitan. They play
Yeah.
the Capitals, who they lost against earlier this year, the Rangers. Um, then they start going back out west against the Preds, back to the Flyers, Blackhawks. So this next month will be a true test to them to see how they are
Right.
throughout the season, how they stand in their conference. But a lot of the, like I said, the Metropolitan, I'm very shocked with how things are turning out. Like the Penguins aren't doing too hot, the Capitals aren't doing too hot. Teams that we thought had the golden standard of being the best in that division, same with the Rangers, just aren't quite there
Right.
where they were last.
You still have Carolina up there, right? Carolina is
Yep.
still a really good team. If I look at the standings right here, I think they're second behind the Devils in the Metro. Um, so
Yes,
obviously,
it's them and the Islanders tied for
yeah,
second.
and yeah, the Islanders has actually been a pretty good surprise. But in a way, though, like as bad as they played last year, they still have good pieces like
Mm.
Oliver Wahlstrom and Matt Barzell and some of these other younger forwards. I always liked them. And obviously they had really strong playoff success a few years ago when they kept going to the East Finals. But I'm a little bit surprised in the Metro that the uh, Blue Jackets have started out as bad as they have. Because that's another team that I looked at the beginning of the year, and I'm like, okay, they got Pat Line. He's playing alongside Johnny Gaudreau now, who came in from the Flames. And I like Merzlikins in that as a goalie. I think he's pretty good. Um, and they've got some other like role players around, especially on defense. They've got I think I forget his name. Zach Werenski, I think, is one of the best defensemen in the game, but they've been
Yeah, I
awful.
think that's.
Yeah, they've been awful. So the Blue Jackets are a little bit surprising at just how bad they've been. Like I didn't think they were going to be at the top of the division, but I didn't think they were going to start out as horribly as they had. But speaking of schedules, you were talking about who the Devils have coming up. The Bruins have a gauntlet as well, and this is where it will get interesting because like they've been able to coast, like they've beaten Anaheim and Dallas and they've beaten up on some of these like lesser teams like the Canucks and the Sabres, but now they're going to start to play like this is after tonight when they play the Blackhawks. If you're listening, you probably know the result of that game already. But after that, next week is away Florida, away Tampa, home against Carolina. That's a tough week. Those are like
You get your most of your East.
right. And then you've got Tampa again the following week, and then Colorado, Vegas, Colorado, Arizona, Vegas, Islanders, Kings, Blue Jackets, Florida up until Christmas. So, I
Yeah,
mean,
it's
they have
a.
a couple layups in there. Like, I think the Blue Jackets at home on a Saturday afternoon, like, that's a pretty good win possibility. But the rest of those are all like, even going out to Arizona, like, I know they're awful, but I mean, that's a weird place now. So, yeah, there are some examples. Just playing Vegas twice, Tampa twice, and Colorado twice. Not to mention Florida twice in that time span, and then plus the Devils after Christmas. Like that's going to be tough for the Bruins. So I'm not sure they're going to be able to hold on to the 15-2 pace the whole way. They got Swayman back, and they'll need him. Olmark's been amazing, but they'll need both their goalies. So we'll see what happens. What do you think about the Western Conference? I've been surprised at how good Seattle's been.
I've been surprised how good the Kings have been out
Yeah.
west. I'm like I said, I'm surprised that Edmonton and Calgary are doing so poorly out west. I
Right.
understand why Colorado is. They have a lot of injuries on that team right now.
Right. But they're still
Um,
nine and
but
five. They're still in third place.
yeah, there's still contention. But like Winnipeg, you talked about how they have a shot. They're doing pretty good at point behind Dallas and watching a few of their games. But
Yeah.
like we just both said, the Pacific, the Kings and the Kraken, just two teams surprising us.
Right. And then Bruce Cassidy's Knights. I mean, they like I knew they had talent. It was just they got the right coach in there for that talent. And they're I think other than the Devils and Bruins, been the most like dominant team all year. So the Pacific has been a little bit surprising. I didn't think the Kraken were going to be that good. But here they are. And then yeah, the Flames have been a little disappointing because I well, Huberdeau was hurt for a while, and then they had all these home games at the beginning of the year. They played like 10 of their first 11 games in Calgary. And they, I think at one point, lost like 7 or 8 in a row. And so it's like you blew that opportunity. Like if they got off to a hot start, I mean, it would have been hard to catch them in that division. But they, as you mentioned when we first started recording, they haven't gelled as a team yet. There's, I think, too many new faces, in a way. Like Ruzic's is new, and Nazem
Mhm.
Kadri, and Huberto, and Uyghur, and it's just they haven't found their rhythm. So I think they'll end up being a playoff team at the end of the year, but I thought they were going to be up there as one of the best teams in the West, and that's just not been the case. And Edmonton, despite really strong play from McDavid and Draisaitl and uh their normal stars, they've been pretty disappointing as well. What do you think about the possibility of sort of a reversion to the old way of like maybe 10 years ago where it was like the Devils making the playoffs and the Kings making the playoffs and the the stars being good and being up at the top? Like, do you think that we might have seen a more like throwback style NHL? Like you mentioned that with the Devils, do you think we're seeing a little bit of that?
I think we kind of are just with younger, more athletic talent these days. Like if you look at it, but also we're seeing a lot of difference in goaltending. We're not seeing like your primary back then. It was primary one goaltender who was playing. You try to play him every night. You weren't trying to put your backup in, or maybe you were once in a while, but usually stick with your own guy. But nowadays, for like the Bruins, for example, I was listening to the game today, and Kevin Weeks was on. He was talking about how today's goaltending, especially for the Bruins and the Devils, it's come down to 3-2 goaltenders in their lineup that have made a huge difference. And I think that's key. Like keeping a healthy rotation of goaltenders has been a huge thing because last year the Devils went through, I think, 6 goaltenders, which was the second most behind, I think, the Coyotes, which was
Right.
crazy. But I, like I said, I think that's the only real difference that we saw from the past to now. But like you just said, I think the style is still the same. Like you got to play your solid defense. These guys are much more talented and more athletic these days than they were in the past. And plus, you can't forget that hitting back then was much different to what it is now. But you definitely see there's a lot of you got to be fast. You got to choose the puck goes on the board. Someone's got to be banging the body to stop the puck from moving. And that's what we're seeing a lot of these fast paced teams that can't do that.
Right, and that could be why a team like Edmonton or Calgary, who is relies so much on sort of like really tight skill up front, but then a bunch of like plateaued
Mm.
players in the like bottom two lines and on defense might be struggling a little bit. I don't know.
Yep.
I'm not a huge like expert necessarily on the X's and O's factor between the two styles necessarily, but back to your point about goaltending. I think that's a really huge point because if you look at the best goaltenders in the league right now, it's not the guys that you expected because those guys were carrying a huge weight. Like Shesterkin's been okay, like
Mhm.
and uh oh gosh, Vasilevsky's been okay, but the best goaltenders have been the ones that have played behind a good defense and then also just like not had all the pressure on them. Like Omar's played a lot of games for Boston, but he knows that like, okay, I've got Swayman. We actually had Keith Kincaid play a game or two while Swayman was hurt. And it's like he feels rested because last year he didn't play 65 games. He might have only played 50 games. Whereas, as you pointed out, the older NHL, like a guy like Marty Brodeur, he probably played 70 out of 82 games. I bet if you went and looked back, he didn't have many years where he played less than 65. And I think the Bruins have been doing that for a while with Rask. Like even when Rask was still playing, they had Halak or Anton Hudobin or somebody like that playing in net behind Rask. And goalie health does have a huge impact on how consistent your team can play. I think there's almost like an intrinsic factor of like if you have confidence in who's in the net behind you, then a team will feel more confident because it's just there's more continuity. So I think that's really important. Now, speaking of continuity, there was something that I think this will lead to a larger conversation. There was something that you and I brought up before we started recording. There hasn't been a lot of continuity in the television access of the NHL. It used to be that with NBC, we had you could almost bank on a Monday night game, a Wednesday night game, a Saturday afternoon game that was national that you could get anywhere. Now it seems like since ESPN and TNT took over, I don't really know where to find the national games. Like if the Bruins aren't playing on NESN, I don't really know how to watch. Are you having that same experience?
I'm having that same experience as well. And I know since they went over, especially for like TNT, they're mainly been basketball for the last few years. So majority of the time they're gonna throw a basketball game on over a hockey game just because the popularity people watch more basketball than they do hockey, which it shows mathematically the correlation of viewership. In my opinion, I rather watch a hockey game than a basketball game. But I can't get anything like we talked about today. Like I couldn't find today's game. I had all college football games. I looked on ESPN, ESPN Plus, Hulu. Usually throw it on one of those. Nothing but except those like national games that's only at night. So it's either going to be maybe the 7 o'clock rivalry game or a 10 o'clock game. And most of the time I can't watch a 10 o'clock game. But I can hardly find anything on it. But I also don't see much coverage on these shows. So like ESPN, for example, I'll stay up and watch like ESPN or next morning I watch ESPN or I watch like First Take, something like that. And they don't talk anything about hockey. It's NBA, NFL, and maybe a touch of baseball or another sport. That's it, which I find kind of confusing because ESPN is supposed to cover all basics of sports, and
The
I don't
worldwide leader
see
in
that.
sports, supposedly.
Yeah,
Right. Well,
but
you're
the
right.
NBA are yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to
Oh,
cut you
I was
off.
just gonna say the only fun stat that I've seen so far that ESPN posted is that USA is not ranked number one in basketball for the first time in over 20 years. France is ranked number one, which I find is crazy, but I do believe it's true after watching the new Netflix documentary. I think it's like the Redeem Team, which totally makes sense because basketball style is totally different here in America than it is in every other country, which is mind blowing.
Yeah. Well, and actually, you bring up a good point. While you're talking about international sports and basketball, they also came out this week that there's not going to be a World Cup of hockey in 2024. Now,
Yes.
obviously, we're getting ready for the FIFA World Cup, which I don't think anybody can argue is probably the biggest sporting event in the world. So I'm not saying that any event, whether it's the FIBA World Cup or in basketball or the World Cup of Hockey or the World Baseball Classic, I don't think any of those will ever get to where the FIFA World Cup is. That's unrealistic, and I don't think anybody's saying that. but it is kind of annoying how, okay, so we're getting ready. The World Baseball Classic will be happening in in March or April of this coming year, 2023. Obviously, 2024 will have the Olympic basketball again in Paris. But there's not there, and if France is number one in basketball, that's going to be a huge tournament for men's basketball at the 24 Olympics. But we don't have a World Hockey Tournament. We don't. They had they had it at the Olympics. I think the 2010 Olympics, the 2010 gold medal game with the US and Canada was probably the best hockey game ever played on Canadian soil in Vancouver between USA and Canada. It was the most fervor there's ever been in this country or Canada. Obviously, everyone loves hockey in Canada all the time, but it was like it could have been the start of something great, which is you have a best on best tournament, but there's not one of those because the Olympic hockey tournament, it just doesn't cut the mustard for me. Now the women's tournament's awesome because it's the best women in the world against one another, but the men's tournament in the Olympics for hockey is just really underwhelming. So we really need to get back to the World Cup of hockey if we can. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yep.
Do you agree that the Olympic tournament's underwhelming?
I do agree with that. I mean, it's still very like the NHL has a hold over the NHL players of when they can go play, when they can't go play for their national country. And as we saw for, I think it's this international year that they're not allowing I think it's the Czech, one of the countries they're not allowing the Russian players to go play for their respective teams over there because of what's going on with Ukraine and Russia. And I totally understand it, but I also feel bad for the players because their opportunities being taken away for something they cannot control and it's out of their hand. But we also don't see this. We don't get the best of the best. Like you said, I want to see the best of the best. We're not getting the best American players out there to play the best Canadian players because they're playing the NHL season most of the time and they don't
And
get a chance to.
Even the best Swedish players or the best Finnish players or Norwegian.
And there's a lot of good players out there. Like I want to see the best. I don't want to. I mean, I don't want to feel bad. Say like the college players don't get the opportunity. They do. I'm sure there's some great college players. But there's a big difference between playing at the college level, playing at the NHL level, and it takes them a couple of years to get there. And I want to see our best team. Who's the best team like they do in the NBA? How they dominated for all those years. I want to see how we stack up against these other teams. Who's number one? Like we used to see back in the day. We used to see Canada, USA, Russia were the top three, but nowadays I think there would be a lot more teams in the mix.
Right.
Like we just talked about.
I think Sweden's probably the
up
top
there.
2 or 3.
So like why can't we do that? Why can I not see that?
Yeah, and it's like we don't even have it doesn't even have to be like during the Olympics. Like the World Cup of Hockey, I thought was a great idea because the NHL ran it, much like the MLB operates the World Baseball Classic in conjunction with the International, Federation of baseball. The same thing happens with the FIBA, and they let NBA players go over and play in the FIBA World Cup when that happens. So like we could definitely have it obviously will never, like I said, never be like soccer and never be as like prestigious, but you could have a World Cup of Hockey and it doesn't even have to be like in the middle of the season. Like it could be in September like it was in 2016. And it could be played in North America where the majority of NHL players live during the season. And it would solve a problem. The first problem being that we don't have best on best because a lot of Americans and Canadians and even European players who would play in the Olympic tournament can't. And so what happens is you have pro players abroad in Europe that are allowed to play. Like David Krejci was allowed to play for the Czech Republic in 2022 because he wasn't playing in the NHL at the moment. And so he's like playing, he's a pro against like amateurs, and it's just not a representative tournament. And it's really sad because like, think about it for a second. The American team now might be better than the team that almost beat Canada in 2010. Like Zach Parise, your favorite Devil, um, scored that amazing goal against Roberto Luongo in that gold medal game. And then we saw him in one more Olympics, and now he's way too old to probably make the team. He wouldn't make the team anymore. Patrick Kane would probably be the only one from 12 years ago that would make the team these days. But you look around, you got the Kachuk brothers, Austin Matthews, Jack Eichel. All these guys are American. Seth Jones, John
The
Carlson,
Hughes brothers.
the Hughes brothers, right? Charlie McAvoy, uh, Connor Hellebuck. I mean, the list goes. Cale Makar. I don't know if he's Canadian or not. Actually, he might be
I
Canadian.
can't remember. But I just, I guess
He
like
went to school in
we just
America,
said,
but I think he's Canadian.
yeah,
But still, yeah, the Hughes
we don't
brothers.
get to see we don't get to see the best anymore. Like that's the point of like the world championships or the Olympics. It's supposed to be the best of the best. You're representing your home nation. Like you're representing all the people. Like we're here watching you, we're here supporting you. We want to see who's the best. Like we don't want to see these other sadly amateurs. We want to see why who stands above the top.
Right. And like
That
the
was
the
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 point of
amateur
these.
turn I totally agree. The amateur tournament is not horrible if you look at it through the lens of it being
No.
an amateur tournament. Like I like the World Juniors. I think the IHF does a great job with the World
Mm.
Juniors. And then I like the World Championships because most of those guys are amateurs. You might get a few pros in there after the season's over. Um but I enjoy those tournaments for what they are. But when I think about the Olympic tournament, I think of it's supposed to be best on best. And then when the Olympic tournament isn't there anymore, okay, if maybe you can have no NHLers in the Olympics, and then that can be your premier amateur tournament, I'm fine with that. But I want to see best on best because think about Team Canada right now. Their centers right now would be McDavid, McKinnon, Tavares, Bergeron, Stamkos. The I
That's
mean,
just one line.
well, yeah, that's just one position. Yeah, you can make up a line with how could I forget Sidney Crosby? Um, so yeah, like that's just guys who play center who would be on Team Canada.
Yeah.
Not to mention,
That's like that's just meaning like just a few. Like that's not even including like all the NHL teams who have
right?
top notch players.
Yeah. So I think if you're talking about the popularity of the sport, having a best on best tournament would go a long way. Like if you want somebody like ESPN tying our conversation here together, if you want somebody like ESPN or TNT to buy in, like it's got to be a little more interesting perhaps than, New Jersey versus the Capitals on a Saturday night. Like as good as that is to us, that might not move the needle for anybody
Yeah,
else.
I just think we also got to find some more. I mean, there's a lot of flair right now in the NHL, but I don't see it stacking up to like how the NBA does it with like high scoring points of like now they're averaging what like 100 plus points a game is the new norm. But I get it, like people want points, people want. I know they want faster paced sports, and NBA is not really a fast paced sport to be honest. It's literally not. That's just not how the game rolls. And the ball doesn't lie. Like you're hot and you're cold for certain streaks, like you up and down. Hockey, it's fast all the time.
Yeah.
You can never expect what's gonna happen. In the NBA game, it's kind of more a little bit more easier to see when the team's going up and the team's going down.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to fix the play. Like we're seeing amazing goals scored and so much
Trevor
better skill
Zegras.
in the NHL than we saw 10 years ago.
Yeah, for
Like it's
sure.
crazy. Like everyone's starting to catch up with each other. Like we've never seen this before. Like different moves behind the nets. Like it's just crazy. But the NBA, I just don't see it. I don't get the flair. I guess fans see the more paparazzi of Steph Curry just draining threes nonstop. And it's a lot harder to do that in the NHL since it is a lot more of a physical game. Not saying basketball is not as physical, but it's just not comparative. Have to go out play back to back games, getting your body destroyed to help your team win compared to the NBA where there's also a lot more flopping. There is no flopping in the NHL. There is very hard to flop. I mean, you can on a
Yeah,
high
and if you do,
stick.
you get penalized.
Yeah, and the NBA, I think you do a little. You get fined if you get caught, but it's just like no.
Yeah, I mean they don't call technicals for that often in the NBA. It's rare, but they don't necessarily always call embellishment in the NHL, but they sometimes do. I just want to make one more point though about the global game because this is
Mhm.
something that I've really been beating the drum on for a while. Tell me if you think this would be a good idea. Um, you have during the early October. October might actually be a poor month for it. You might want to do it every 2 years instead of the All Star game if you do it this way. So let's say February every 2 years. You do the World Cup of Hockey, but instead of having um, all the teams in one area, what if you did a weekend where the Swedish and the Finnish players went back to Sweden and Finland? And I heard Elliot Friedman talk about this on 32 Thoughts, the podcast. So this isn't my idea. But if you went back to and had like Sweden and Finland play each other over there on a
Mhm.
best of three over a weekend, and then in and then over in America, you have uh you have USA and Canada play each other best of three over the weekend. And then you have perhaps in Europe, like Slovakia and the Czech Republic play one another best of three. And then you have potentially a handful of other countries, whether that's like Germany or Norway or Denmark or Switzerland or Russia, if they're allowed back in, or
Mhm.
anybody else. And then the following weekend, you take this is where it becomes my own idea. The following weekend, you take the four winners of those best of three and you play another single elimination tournament where you seed the four and you'd only have to play two games, four to bring it down to two, and then two to bring it down to the eventual champ. And then you'd have a World Cup of Hockey champ. And it would only take 2 weekends, and you could still play if you wanted NHL, like one NHL game during the week in between, and it would be a lot better than putting taking 2 full weeks off for the Olympics or whatnot. And
I
you could
think
do
it's
it
a
for the
pretty.
women too.
I think it's a good idea, but I think the ideal time to do it would be in August. I think
You
that'd
think
be a
so?
perfect time because you don't have many sports going on. You have
Yeah,
preseason for football, not many people really interested in that. Baseball's still going on. I mean, it starts to heat up a little bit, but it's still like midway through the season, about three-quarters of the season done. But it's like I think that's the prime time to put something else on. Like it's right before preseason starts for hockey. You get your teams together, work
right.
nationally. Like you get the 2 weeks then. Like you have basically a month or two before that thing starts. You get to train with each other, and then you can do it for 2 weeks, or you can do multiple weeks if you really wanted to break it up. And I
Yeah,
think they will allow for more viewership because, like I said, that gap of when baseball and golf is kind of going on during the summer. There's not much here, at least in the states. Maybe some soccer that's going on, tennis, but like high, fast-paced sports, there's not much.
right. And that could be a good time to do it because if you did it the same year that you would have done the Winter Olympics, right? So the Winter Olympics happens,
Mm-hmm.
every 4 years. But if you were to do it in the off year of the Winter Olympics, that would sort of like, oh no, but then it would be at the same time as the summer. So yeah, you'd have to do it in the same year
Mm-hmm.
as the Winter Olympics. That way it didn't
Yeah,
collide with the Summer Olympics, and you could still have it every 2 years on an even numbered year, and you could have a different host city every time. Like it could
yeah,
be, and if you did, like you could actually have a pair of host cities, and they could share it together. And that way you could have multiple, and it could happen in an NHL arena. Like you could have Vancouver and Seattle, or Toronto and Buffalo, or Jersey and New York, or
but
you
I
know,
think the only difference is they had to make the rinks a little bit bigger because I know the
that's right.
national size is a little bit bigger
You're
compared to
right.
the NFL size,
Yeah,
which does make play style a little bit different. So it allows for the
right.
players
I
to have more
think
advantage over the goaltender.
I think the IIHF gave a waiver in the 2010 Olympics when it was being played at the Canucks Arena. I could be wrong. But yeah, you're right. It would change the game a little bit if they had to go by IHF rules and have a wider ice surface. But that's just an idea I threw out there, because like we spent this whole last half hour talking about hockey and how much we enjoy it and how much we want it to be focused on. But I think that starts with an international tournament. I think it does. I think it starts there, and then um, I think it continues. You know, the NFL they nixed the Pro Bowl. Um, they're gonna make it like a skills competition, which it pretty much already was. The NHL does their All-Star game usually the same weekend as the NFL Pro Bowl, so maybe they should switch that up. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of different elements that go into it. Did one thing I want to close the show on though, going back to NHL specific. Did your Stanley Cup winner change? Prediction change now that we're almost a quarter of the way through the season?
Yes.
Is
Had
it
yours.
so? Who was it before? I forgot.
Oh gosh, I think it was the Avalanche
Yeah,
and Carolina. I want to
yeah,
say
yeah,
the Canes. I think is who I picked,
yeah.
or the Rangers. Those two.
Who do you have now? Do you still like that matchup? You said you wanted to change.
I don't know. I guess the season's too young, but if I have to go off of what's going on now, I'm definitely gonna say probably the Knights and the Devils.
All right. Well, just for conversation's sake, I'll say Bruins and Knights because that would be, as you pointed out in our last
Mm-hmm.
show, if Bruce Cassidy wins the Stanley Cup with the Knights, it would hurt a hell of a lot more if he did it against the Bruins. And I also spoke in my show last week about both of those teams being a buzzsaw. So I will stick with that. That would be a lot of fun. That would be insane. Uh, and I would love it. I would also love it if it was the Devils too for you. So we'll check in there. All right, Kyle, thanks for tuning in with me this afternoon, and to all our listeners and watchers, thanks for checking in with us. If you're watching on YouTube, definitely subscribe below. And if you're listening on audio, hit us up there, Spotify, Apple, Google, wherever you listen to podcasts. Kyle and I will be back probably together in another month or so. Maybe we'll bring Cam in too. But until then, I hope you all have a great rest of your week and a happy Thanksgiving. Kyle, thanks for coming on, buddy.
No problem.
All right.